Hello and welcome to our sharing on communications and returning to the office post-COVID-19 circuit breaker measures. By means of self-introduction, my name is Martin Garner and I'm the current Honorary Treasurer of the Business Continuity Chapter of the Singapore Computer Society. I'm also a Director of a consultancy business here in Singapore. With over 35 years working in areas such as engineering, manufacturing, financial services, transport and communication sectors. I'm a Chartered Director and Fellow of the Institute of Directors London and a Fellow and Committee Member of the Singapore Institute of Directors. And as part of that, I have committee responsibilities for online Director Development Programme. Today, I'll be talking with Christopher Lim, who is Vice President of the Business Continuity Chapter within Singapore Computer Society. Christopher's been working in the banking industry for around 30 years in various roles from IT security, BCM to compliance. His current role as a Chief Operating Officer of a European offshore bank includes overseeing all technology and banking operation matters. And this now includes heading the Human Resources Department. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for your time.
Pleasure, Martin. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
Chris, as you know, as part of Singapore's response to COVID-19 pandemic, Singapore's implemented circuit breaker measures since the 7th of April 2020 to preempt escalating COVID-19 infections. With the end of the circuit breaker now in sight, of course, and pending further announcements from the government, I'd like to begin, if you don't mind, with a couple of questions on, how do we communicate to our stakeholders about returning to office? So, Chris, with the impending return to office in the horizon, what are the factors organisations should consider to prepare themselves for this important move?
Yeah, Martin, that's a great question. The Director General of the World Health Organization had mentioned a few conditions that must be met before countries can start lifting restrictions. And one of which is that the transmission rate must be kind of under control. And secondly, country must be able to detect, test, isolate, treat, and trace every case. So in this aspect, he emphasized that preventive measure must be put in place in the essential places, such as offices, workplaces, and schools. So community should be fully informed and be engaged on how to adjust to this new norm, or what is called now a new normal. So this new normal is also something our government had mentioned in their plan for our economy to restart. So given this backdrop, Martin, the Singapore government has already announced the lifting of the circuit breaker and put forth their plans for having a three-phase approach for return to office. So I would suggest all organizations to keep abreast of the requirement for returning to the office. Yeah. So some of the areas that they have to be aware of are the regulatory requirements. Does your organization fall under the list of business allowed to reopen under phase 1? So that you have to check. What are the conditions that you have to comply with in your business reopening? So for example, the number of employees or the number of customers that are allowed into your store, into your shop, or into your office. Or the need to implement contact tracing and temperature checking for all staff and customers. So I would advise all organizations to look at the list. If you're unsure, you can find information on the covid.gobusiness.gov.sg. And secondly, you have to be aware of the industry level specific requirements. So any special requirement in your specific industry. For example, the need of safe distancing if you're providing transportation for workers from one place to another. So meaning in a vehicle, you have to ensure that there's a safe distancing requirement. So would there be any additional precaution that needed for the frontline staff to interact with your customer? Example, on top of putting the face mask, are you required to put on a face shield for staff protection? And then finally, do we have a good communication strategy? So, and if so, have we actually communicated to our staff? So what we call internal communication to the staff, right? So do all your staff know what is happening on Tuesday, the 2nd of June, when your business reopen? Okay, think about it. So maybe you should prepare a communication to your staff now and send it to them. Have we also prepared our external communication to regulators, to government agency if needed?
Yeah, Chris, I mean,
Yeah.
that is very, very interesting. You know, what would you say are the practical challenges involved with these aspects?
Mm. Yeah, it's actually a very challenging time. So in this challenging time, businesses have to consider between profitability versus resiliency. So all organizations would have to be prepared that recovery will be neither quick nor easy. Although you may have the solution to move forward and want to move forward quickly, as most organizations want to, there may be some setbacks along the way, as there is a possibility that the government may introduce additional measures to be implemented along the way that may restrict your recovery solution. So do not expect that when we wake up on the 2nd of June, everything will be back to normal. Well, there's always going to be a trade-off between economy and health security, as this is a unprecedented time. So in my opinion, Martin, all governments around the world will need to decide carefully the fine line between economic performance and public health when they decide to lift the restriction and return the country to normalcy, or what we call the new normal.
Yeah, I mean that's really good stuff, Chris. I mean, can I pick up on just one, very important point you made there, which I think you're very right to point out that come 2nd of June 2020, which by the way is my 60th birthday, people should not expect everything to go back to what it was pre-COVID-19. There's a lot of new challenges ahead, facing everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct, Martin. You're very right. As organization need to change and transform, as there's not much choice for them now, right? A case in point is the recent circuit breaker. So either you continue to work from home, or you don't work at all. So this is a good lesson for all organizations. So what used to be a good idea before, or nice to have, and you used to hear the boss saying, okay, we will implement it later when we are less busy and have the time, must now be taken seriously. Transformation is now a necessity. Working from home is a good example of transformation and a key change. Well, many employers that I have known have previously resisted such arrangement based on the belief that it would tempt employees to slack off and that they cannot monitor their employees' work. But the onset of the pandemic, I must say, has forced organizations to rethink the working from home model. As the workforce has now grown used to working from home with the numerous benefits in terms of productivity, maybe as well as work-life balance. Hence, I think employer will have to show leadership and better communicate with their employees for working from home to succeed. I guess they do not have a choice. I would recommend actually engaging the employees more actively to keep them motivated and to check if what is working and what's not while they are working from home. Something interesting came, I read a report on Sunday, in the Sunday Times on the 24th May. A survey was carried out, has found that 9 out of 10 workers in Singapore wants to continue to work from home in some capacity, now that they've experienced the flexibility. Interestingly, this survey was carried out on 9,000 employees from almost 90 organizations in Singapore. And guess what? 15% of these says that they would like to work from home all the time, whilst the rest prefer a varying amount of time working from home. So this is something I feel organizations have to think about. And another thing, I think there's also a challenge of supply chain that are very interconnected. Supply chains are very interconnected. So if anyone in that supply chain is not ready to continue business, then everyone else in the chain will be affected.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, Martin, as you have done loads of consultancy and training in the area of communication, maybe you'd like to share with our audience some of your inputs based on your experience and observation.
Sure, no problem, Chris. I mean, again, I emphasize you make some excellent points there. I mean, from a communication perspective, I think some of the most important factors to consider are the source and the authenticity of the information that you're communicating. Your organization absolutely should be aware of official sources like government agencies, industry sector guidelines. Fact checking of these and this information is extremely important before you communicate your message. I would suggest avoid, or at least take extreme care if you're using second-hand information or unofficial items that may have been spread through things like social media channels. I think it's very, very important to have, a reliable source of information. And when you're communicating that to your employees, then the chances are it's more right than wrong. The minute in communication that you start giving out wrong or conflicting information, then your communications start to fail. The second key factor for me, it really is to establish clear channels of communication. And I think it's important for people in that respect to appoint appropriate owners who are responsible for these. Inform your stakeholders and your staff as to which are the official sources of information. Where do they come to if they need to know? Establish clear responsibilities and spokespeople, and make sure they're the appropriate spokesperson. And I can't overemphasize that it's vital that you're in control of your communications, just to avoid confusion and contradiction. So, Chris, I mean, moving on, and communicating to staff is important. How should we communicate to staff and other interested parties in terms of, the organization's return to office plans?
Yes, Martin. As we all know, communication is one of the most important aspects for all that are holding leadership positions. So it is basically a leadership-driven thing, and the communication must create trust and authenticity to your audience.
Very, very important, Chris.
Yes. And, employees would like to hear the message from the top, usually from the boss, right?
Yeah.
And the message must always be clear, concise, and consistent. So this is what I call the 3 C's in communication.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what is actually trust and authenticity? So it's just 2 simple lines I have, right? Number one, don't overpromise or overstate information. Say only what you know and what needs to be done. And number 2, be honest. Be honest and admit any shortcomings that you have. So having said that, on the flip side, as we all know, that bad communication may lead to some of the following, right? It will cause damage to companies or your brand name or your brand reputation. It will cause social amplification. If now social media, the bad news goes up quite fast. In fact, very fast.
Very fast.
Legal or government involvement, if you say something that will get you into some legal problem. And then, of course, unfortunately, bad communication may lead to talent flight. So your good employees may choose to leave your organization due to the lack of communication or also poor communication from the top, because they feel demotivated, actually. Yeah. So decrease in productivity is the other one, which may also result in your service level going down. And of course, that leads also to the loss of revenue and business. So organizations need to prepare different messages for different interested parties, such as your staff, the regulators, the press, the public, the landlord, and so forth. So basically, communication, as you know, can be divided into 2 forms. One is the internal communication, and the other external communication. I just touched a little bit on external communication. Actually, external communication, you are sending a message to an external party and providing only information. So with that, you may not need to go into details as much as opposed to communicating with your internal staff. Internal communication to your staff or stakeholder is a different ballgame. You have to be transparent by sending one consistent message and provide them with as much information as possible, as opposed to communicating externally. As what I mentioned much earlier, there must be trust and authenticity. So the catchphrase I would recommend is one message, one voice. The other thing about communication, in addition, I would also urge that the organization prepare their communication. Organization also need to also consider the appropriate communication media given the current social distancing requirement. So how do you communicate to your staff now? So do you want to do it via email to all your employees? So email is actually, as we know, is a faceless communication. You just blast the email and your employees will read it. Or you prefer doing conferencing, like what we are doing now, Martin, you and I, while we are staying at home, via various conference apps like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, Google Meet, and so forth. So this, I think, has the advantage to allow the employer or the employees to see the employer when the employer is giving a communication message. So just like it allows me to look at you and see what you're talking. So it's more as close to we are in person together. The other one we can use is social media. So WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. As you know, these are usually very useful for external communication. And maybe I would suggest as a last media we can consider, maybe a recording by the boss to communicate the message in a speech to the staff. So that's also a possibility. I would just like to share with you something, Martin, which I found very interesting. So a recent research conducted across 13 markets and 9,000 over employees by a NASDAQ listed company called, the company is called Everbridge, whose business is dealing with critical event management. So in that research, they found 4 prevailing themes, or four prevalent themes. Number one, employees are more disparate or different and diverse than ever. Number two, business are missing critical channel of communication, which is true. Number three, employees expect more information. And number four, organization can be the single point of truth during critical event.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, I think the last point is very interesting for me. Are you saying that people would look first into government messengers, but on a secondary level, put their trust more in the employer to look after their well-being and to provide direction? How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, it seems that way, Martin, from the research. And yes, I would kind of agree with that, because I think this is somewhat true, as most of us spend more than half of our waking time in the office or at work. And we kind of expect our employer to provide guidance and what is necessary for their livelihood and for the organization to survive, right? So we always take direction from the employer, besides just, of course, expecting that our salary get paid. So I think communication carries, if you carry out the communication in a clear manner, it can not only activate your employees, but also encourage them to help them speed up your organization recovering process in a more efficient manner. Conversely speaking, a lack of planning in communication may lead to a longer and more expensive recovery process for your organization. The other point, communication, I like to say, is also a key to a successful recovery plan and should be flexible. Right? The use of multi-channel method must be considered dependent on the scope of crisis. I would like to say that communication is both to inform and form. No pun of words intended, Martin. But we are using communication not only to inform our employees by providing them updates and information, but communication can be also used to form our organization culture. The intent of the communication and the content of the information must always go hand in hand and must be in parallel or be in sync. Yeah, maybe be in sync, that's a better word to use. So with this, Martin, what do you think? Do you have any advice for our audience on communication?
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I think you've covered the topic fairly comprehensively. For me, I would add that at times like these, where we're all facing a pandemic of this scale and nature, and with situations that, quite frankly, most of us have never had to face before, clarity and decisive leadership are key factors that will help us get back to a normal or new normal situation, which you referenced earlier.
Right. Thanks, Martin. Now, maybe it's time I'll throw the ball back to you, Martin.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should ask you a question. Yeah, what do you think, Martin? What information do you think should be communicated to staff to prepare them for the first day upon returning to the office?
Okay, that's a great question. That's $1 million question, Chris. Thank you. I mean, as mentioned earlier, I think communication's got to be clear, concise, and consistent. Employees need to know when they are required back to the office. I think there was the Prime Minister's speech in the UK recently when he announced people going back to the office live on the news. He caused quite a lot of confusion because there was not a lot of detail behind it. That only came out the following day. So I think it is important that it has to be clear and organized, and that employees do need to know when they're required back in the office. They need to know who is needed at each phase of the return to work process, because as you know, here in Singapore, it's going to be done on a phased approach. And the last thing you need to do is to create confusion, and which could ultimately hinder your restart process. Again, there's no one answer for this, but I've thought about a few key considerations that I think people maybe should look at, and I categorize them into 3 categories. The first one of those being the safety and health of employees, which I think is really the most important aspect in many ways. So some practical tips I would give is, inform people about things like the cleaning and sanitizing schedule of the office. Ensure the office is clean before staff go back on the first day. It's a simple thing, but it's something that could be easily overlooked. Wearing of face masks, at the moment we're faced with wearing face masks most of the time. So consider how could you provide face masks and sanitizers to all staff, and if it's actually possible. Other practical things I'm looking at myself, things like improving the air quality in the office, change of air conditioning and humidifiers, introduction of things like hands-free solutions, and such as reducing the number of touch points. We've all seen now, we all scan when we go to the supermarket, and using biometric readers, etc. Staggering of work hours, split shift, ensure no commingling, and especially when you've got staff congregating in the pantry or rest area. No cross deployment of staff should be allowed, and I think that's actually still a requirement from the government. Staggering lunch hours, or better still, can you cater lunch for your staff so they don't need to go out into public areas? So there's just a few practical things there. I'm sure there are a lot more things, and people need to look to government for advice on things like that in particular. The second point I'd like to raise would be things like physical distancing. I think we've all become used to the social distancing things that we have to consider now. So consider really things like how your office needs to be reconfigured, who's going to sit where. This could result in a reduction of productive working space or reduction of workstations. So, how are you going to configure your office? I've been into many offices where there are a lot of people together in close proximity. That has to be looked at very carefully. Again, managing social distancing within the work environment. And maybe a really good thing would appoint an in-house ambassador for that. You know, somebody, you know, most people go in there and they're concentrating on their work, and, you know, sometimes you just forget. So just have somebody maybe that just keeps an eye on things.
Well,
And
that's a great idea, Martin. That's a
yeah,
really, really good idea.
I mean, I find actually, I've done this a number of times when I've gone to the garage to get petrol. I've jumped out of my car without my face mask on, and some nice, kind pump attendant has said, waved at me and said, you know, please put your mask on. Oh, sorry, yeah. So yeah, and you know, if employees are assigned in a different, assigned to work in a separate location, they need to know, and staff need to know where to go. So you know, all these things have to be communicated clearly. It shouldn't be a case that, you know, people turn up to the office on the 2nd of June or whenever, and then you start thinking about it. So this should have all been done before. This should have all been clearly communicated to people. And you know, another very interesting thing, and I think it's part of the new normal, is will there still be flexible work arrangements, you know, such as working from home for employees that are non-essential support, or employees who don't actually need to be in the office? So some careful planning needs to go around that. And I think just in my final point would be things like contact tracing. You know, I think the government has done a really good job with implementing apps and such that does that, and it's allowed them to, you know, when there's been an outbreak of COVID in a particular area or whatever, to be able to track more accurately the people that have been there, and I think that's shown in terms of how the government's managed to manage this situation. So how will you be able to trace the visitors and staff movements in your office? And, you know, what application will your office be using? I think we've all heard of Trace Together, Safe Entry, etc. Or are we just going to employ a manual recording system? You know, it's not an exhaustive list, Chris, but you know, these are things that we really have to consider.
Great point, Martin. Those are really, really great.
Unfortunately, Chris, I think I'm sort of getting the nod that we're running out of time a little bit. So I just wonder, Chris, if in closing, maybe, do you have any sort of final thoughts that we can sort of impart to our viewers?
Yes, Martin, actually I have two, but I will just keep it short. One, I think, is that we must be cognizant that it is a gradual resumption back to the office. So the process will be a gradual process. So communication is key in order for employers not to create any confusion, like you have mentioned just 2 minutes ago. So communication has to be clear, and your employee, which are your prime asset, need reassurance that they are taken care of and well protected in office, so that they in return can concentrate to give their best output to assist your organization to get back on track after the COVID situation. And my second point is I would like to actually highlight that the COVID-19 seems to be under control. But even though it's under control, the threat of the virus will never be totally eradicated until a vaccine or robust treatment is found. Well, that's my view anyway. Yeah. And until that happens, there is always a risk of another infection or outbreak that may reset us back to where we started. So I would like to highlight that all organizations must be prepared for a rollback to circuit breaker strategy, which requires a swift and decisive response from management. And this process of rolling back, we should already have in place, as we have the experience of hindsight of the circuit breaker. So in my final takeaway is that all of us should frequently review our pandemic recovery plan once again and be prepared for uncertainties ahead to stay resilient. Yeah, that's all I have, Martin. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I mean, thanks, Chris. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but you know, I've really enjoyed talking with you today, and thank you for sharing, you know, your experience and thoughts.
You're welcome.
It's been great.
My pleasure. Yeah. Good to talk to you too.
Well, yeah, and please stay safe as well, Chris. Look, I hope this session's been helpful for the viewers, and you know, I hope we haven't been able to cover everything, but I hope we've been able to give you some useful tips maybe, and some points that you can think about. I think finally, I mean, you know, refer to relevant government agency requirements and advice. That's important. And I think in closing, you know, if you do share this with your friends and business associates, there is a link for this. And if you found this session useful, please feel free to share. So I think in closing, I'd just like to, again, thank you, Chris, and to thank everybody. And, you know, please keep safe. And I hope come June the 2nd that you start your journey in a very positive way on the road to the new normal. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.